Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Your glance at sex, society, and culture.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Hello, everyone. We are really excited to be back for our fourth episode of the Peep Show podcast. We have some really great guests today. We'll be talking to Kashmir of Gizmodo Media Group about the way in which the Facebook feature People You May Know outs sex workers. And we will also be talking to Reese Piper, a Brooklyn-based journalist, stripper, and autistic woman, about the need to create space for sex workers to voice complaints about their jobs without condemning their work. But first, PJ and I will be talking about the new Patreon content guidelines.
Today we want to talk about Patreon's new content guidelines, which have caused an uproar among adult content producers. And as background, we're recommending Samantha Kuhl's article titled Adult Content Creators. Patreon is doing exactly the opposite of what we asked for in Vice's motherboard. Historically, Patreon has had a positive relationship with adult content creators and helped fund erotica writers and sex memoirists, nude photographers and illustrators, adult models and porn performers, and yes, even sex podcasters. Just a year ago, adult content producers celebrated when Patreon announced it would process payments from PayPal for them because direct payment for adult content is banned by PayPal's terms of service. And Patreon's old guidelines even tried to be sex positive, saying, some of the world's most beautiful and historically significant art often depicts nudity and sexual expression. Because of that, we allow nudity and suggestive imagery, as long as it's marked not safe for work. Think of this policy as allowing R-rated movies, but then also saying, Patreon is not for pornography. The new content guidelines get rid of this sex-positive language and puts the focus on what's not allowed. Sex worker, writer, and content creator Liara Rue posted an open letter of concern that was signed by hundreds of other creators and patrons, including the Peep Show podcast. CEO Jack Conte responded, but the reaction was mixed. Conte did meet one of the letter's demands, stating clearly that violation would lead to account suspension and not account deletion, meaning that content creators would still have access to funds once they came into compliance. However, Conte did little to clarify what Patreon perceives as pornography, essentially leaving it to the subjective, you know it when you see it test. Most importantly, Conte fails to appreciate the solidarity between adult content creators. That when he says this only affects a few accounts, we hear him asking us to throw our peers under the bus and know that we'll be next. I want to close by reading a few key paragraphs from the letter. We see that you stated that you will work with content creators to make sure their pages aren't taken down. But that is not enough. What is lost in this discussion is that the most vulnerable people will be the hardest to, quote, work with. These will disproportionately be queer, trans, and people of color. These will be creators less steeped in the language of erotica, just knowing that they want to create and entertain and that their skills lie in a sexual arena. We must listen not just to creators trained in classic mediums, art school graduates, those fluent in theory, and the other ways adult content is made more palatable to the cultured class. We must also listen to and represent those who simply make porn, who want to be creative with their porn, yes, but most importantly, want to be self-directed. Your platform has given these people a light. We know people who would be homeless if it wasn't for making porn on Patreon. And it's not a small number. We know people who employ many queer performers, workers, subcontractors, all working to make beautiful content. And while we understand the desire to police illegal content off the platform and support it, all of this legal content is beautiful. Who is it at Patreon or anywhere who decides what is art? When is there too much porn, not enough aesthetics? Your fuzzy position on adult content versus porn gives you the freedom to discriminate at will, and it makes content creators live in fear of that discrimination, itself leading to self-censorship of important viewpoints.
This whole controversy over Patreon is actually really confusing to me, particularly given that last week when I placed an ad on the platform where I do phone sex, they rejected it and stated that the reason for the rejection was that the ad linked to my Twitter, which linked to the Patreon for this podcast, and Patreon, they said, was direct competition to their platform. So I find it kind of interesting then that Patreon is claiming that they don't want to be connected with adult content producers when adult content producers are so present on Patreon that the other platforms are threatened by them.
Yeah, I do think that's interesting. It goes to show that Patreon, though not being exclusively seen as a site for adult content, there's a widely held perception that this is a place in which adult content, and specifically independent pornography, thrive. So my question then is, why did Patreon choose to crack down now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And who benefits from that crackdown?
Yeah, I think the question of who benefits is really important, and I like that that came out of the open letter that Liara Rue wrote, because more marginalized people are going to be more greatly affected by it, the ones who can't change their branding in order to fly under the Patreon radar. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, and that's an issue of class and other distinction. Ultimately, the question is, why does Patreon think that this is in their business interest? Are they trying to, quote unquote, clean up their image?
Yeah.
Is it that queer performers or performers who are more explicit and perform a more, quote unquote, lowbrow form of pornography cheapen their brand or scare off potential investors? Like, clearly the CEO didn't just wake up the other day and realize, oh my God, there's a ton of pornography on my site. I better do something about it.
Right.
And have like a personal moral panic. There was a calculated business decision at play that they wanted to discriminate against lowbrow pornography while encouraging highbrow, quote unquote, erotica.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, why do you say that? Do you say that because they're outlawing specific acts that are more explicit, or what is the reason for saying that? Because I'm not sure. I don't know what Patreon's motivation is, so it's hard for me to know where they're coming from.
Well, I don't know either, but this isn't my language. This is the language that Patreon itself employs. The same old distinction that goes back to Gloria Steinem and other feminists in the second wave, distinguishing pornography as bad and erotica as good, and trying to draw the line between good girls and bad girls, high class and low class, exploitative and liberating. Those categories are exactly what Patreon seems to be uncritically embracing as part of their terms of service.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
And there may be some validity to limiting, quote unquote, fringe fetish content. Certainly, it's difficult to police anything that gives the appearance of involving minors, whether or not it doesn't. Mm-hmm. It's also difficult to police things that seem to portray non-consensual acts. And that those kinds of content may be sending the wrong messages. That's a complicated debate.
Sure, right.
But we can kind of understand why they might, as a business, find that problematic. But when it comes down to just the level of explicitness or some vague notion of the artistic value of particular content, I think that's a lot more murky, a lot more subjective, and is ultimately laden with all sorts of class and heteronormative and even racialized values that are almost certainly going to inform the decision making of the content moderators.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually what I was thinking as you were saying that, is who's to say what's erotic and what's pornographic? That seems to be completely subjective.
Right. And again, this is a debate that's been playing out forever, but particularly into the 80s when a certain subgroup of anti-pornography feminists were allying themselves with social conservatives.
Right, yeah.
And in retrospect, I think we're really critical of that idea that some people should be policing
those lines
and
those boundaries between what it is that's erotic and what it is that's pornographic. I think it points to an overarching movement in our culture and shift, though, to more conservatism. I mean, we have Tumblr, for example, was a place where content producers could put a lot of their stuff, and that changed pretty dramatically when Yahoo bought them out. So that's a place in which content used to be available that it no longer is to the same degree. We can't use Facebook and Instagram in that way. So it seems like with all of these new platforms that come up, there's a period of time in which adult content producers can use them until there's a crackdown and there's a narrowing of places that they can go.
Yeah, I totally take your point and agree. Though if I could reframe that, I think it's not that we're moving in a conservative direction, but it's that the cyber libertarianism of Silicon Valley has always been conservative. And that sort of libertarianism champions the freedom to make money.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
Right.
So it will ally itself with certain socially progressive values when it's financially expedient to do so, but it's also equally willing to turn its back on and betray those socially progressive values if it perceives it to be in its financial interest to do so.
Right. Yeah, all of that is a really, really good point. I think that the other problem with it is that there's been such a huge shift in adult content production from a very centralized model to a decentralized model, and you have tons of DIY producers, which is a great thing because it's opened the space for a lot of queer people with non-normative bodies and non-normative sexualities, and cracking down on those sorts of modes of distribution that gave space to them just reinforces discrimination and bias and the narrowing of our conceptions of sexuality and beauty.
Yeah, and I mean, the internet was sold to us as this utopian place where everybody was going to be represented and everybody was going to be free to publish or free to express themselves.
And it's offered that in so many ways, but I feel like we take a couple of steps forward and then even more steps backward, and this seems to fit that pattern.
Right, and I think that at the end of the day, adult content producers aren't really going to be able to trust business people who are primarily in it for the money to protect their freedoms. It's only going to be businesses or organizations that are run by fellow adult content producers that are actually going to be committed to any sort of freedom when it comes to issues of pornography.
Kashmir Hill is an investigative reporter with Gizmodo Media Group. Based in San Francisco, she writes about technology and privacy. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, we're happy to have you here. So you're a technology reporter, which might seem like a bit far afield for a Sex and Society podcast, but so much of your work focuses on privacy that there's some really interesting overlaps there. You've done quite a bit of reporting on the People You May Know recommender algorithm on Facebook, and particularly you wrote a piece about how that algorithm is outing sex workers. So we figured maybe we could start there and then talk about other sorts of privacy implications.
Sure, yeah. For the past year, basically, I've been obsessed with how Facebook makes its uncanny friend recommendations. Essentially, those people that when you sign into Facebook pop up their faces in your People You May Know box. And I've been trying to figure out what information Facebook gathers to figure out who we know in real life. And it's been mysterious to many people because Facebook does have this real ability to figure out who we actually know.
It's really wild, too, because it's people you've met one time.
Yeah, and it's often like people tell me, I saw this person briefly, or I was in an anonymous meeting for parents with suicidal teens, and all of a sudden parents from the meeting were being recommended to me.
Yeah.
And people are just mystified by, what sources of data Facebook has and how they're figuring this out. And so I've been trying to dig into it, and it's been challenging. I still can't say for sure exactly what goes into this algorithm, but I've been trying to document the effects of it beyond just, making people happy and helping them make new connections.
Right.
Yeah. So what sort of information has Facebook offered about this?
So this feature has been around since 2008, so almost a decade now. And Facebook created a help page that tells you that People You May Know is based on mutual friends, shared networks like same job or same school, and then contacts you've uploaded, which also means contacts that other people have uploaded.
Right.
Yeah, because in practice, sometimes those people aren't in any of those categories.
Sometimes they aren't in those categories or not obviously in those categories. And that's kind of the spot that has been driving a lot of my stories about the feature.
Yeah, so tell us about the particular article that you wrote on sex workers and what sort of implication that has for them.
So this story came out last month, and it is about the way that Facebook has been able to match both sex workers with their clients and people who work in pornography with their family and friends when
Right.
their family and friends didn't know that they worked in pornography.
So in both directions.
Yes. Both kinds of matching, both kinds of outing.
Right. So outing people's real names to their clients, but then also outing their performer names to their family.
Yes.
Yeah.
And particularly the sex worker who I called Layla in the piece was really mystified by this because she practices good OPSEC or operational security, where she uses a different phone number for her sex work, a different email address, a different name. And she's never given any of that information to Facebook. So she was really surprised when she started seeing some of her regular clients appear there. And she doesn't understand, and I still don't understand after doing this story, exactly how she was being matched to them. But it is something that has real consequences. It's revealing information that people didn't intend to reveal.
Right.
Thanks to Facebook's just obsessive data mining.
Yeah, part of the reason we were so struck by this article is because we've had similar experiences ourselves, not only with Facebook, but with Instagram, which of course is owned by Facebook and presumably uses some of the same proprietary algorithms.
What has happened to you?
Well, for me in particular, because I do some like erotic photography, in order to have more photo shoots and things like that, you need to have an Instagram account. But I really don't want an Instagram account because I also like having a Facebook account for family things. And I don't necessarily need like the moms down the street to see like erotic pictures of me. But I've done the same thing. I've used completely different email addresses, completely different phone numbers on a completely different platform with a different name to put up photography shoots. And then all of a sudden I'm getting like all of the neighborhood moms as, people that I may know. And the response to that has been, well, just make those accounts private, but that doesn't make a lot of sense in the industry because actually you use those for promotion. So then those accounts, if I want to, keep a Facebook account, becomes completely unusable.
Well, and at this point, it's not clear that it would matter even if you erased your Facebook account. My sense is you'd probably still get the neighborhood moms recommended to you. I mean, of course, having the Facebook account feeds the algorithms, but...
I think it's problematic to assume that people ought to have every single network of theirs integrated. A lot of sex workers we know have just completely stopped using Facebook altogether and do everything that they have on Twitter or on other sorts of platforms because they're less invasive. But that comes at a cost too.
Right. Yeah, it just seems like Facebook is, I wouldn't say it's a public utility, because that's certainly a way it's described by many, many people. But it's certainly something that's become increasingly important to civil society and how you participate, how you get notified about events or business opportunities and promoting yourself. And I think there's a real cost to not using the network. And I think Facebook is making it hard for certain groups of people to use the network because it doesn't let them opt out of people you may know. And when I asked Facebook about this, they just said, we don't think anybody would really find that opt-out useful. Which is Facebook. It takes Facebook a long time, I think, to recognize the needs of certain marginalized groups.
Right. It's funny because I feel like there's few people in my social circles who wouldn't want to opt out of people. And actually, there's another important element of this, too, which maybe we should talk about, which is the real name policy. It's not only that they're sort of mysteriously recommending people to us, but they're also telling us that we have to use our legal names, which again, for sex workers and for many other people is problematic. I mean, not just sex workers, but people who deal with stalking, people who are public figures for one another reason, maybe who are writing on feminist topics or other controversial topics, choose to use pen names. And all of those people are in violation of Facebook's real name policy.
Yeah, I definitely kept encountering that as I was reporting out this story. The inconvenience of forcing all these people to use their real names and then connecting them to everyone they know is kind of like a double whammy or a 1-2 punch.
Right.
In terms of making life difficult for some people who don't necessarily want all of their identities converged into one that is then exposed to everybody that they meet in many different contexts.
Yeah. It's almost like a compulsory integration.
And I think that idea of context is really kind of key here.
Sure.
That's what's really lacking. This idea that we should reveal our whole self to everybody in all contexts really is kind of shocking to me. And I would think should be shocking to anyone who, I don't know, has children, for example. Right? You know, like, there are many situations in which it's entirely inappropriate to reveal, you know, your whole self to another person. And that just seems to be lost on the designers of these social media platforms.
I was actually thinking about it in another way. I was thinking about it in terms of safety for queer kids as well, though, a lot of whom can't come out to their parents, particularly like transgender kids, because of threats of violence. And I know that a lot of teenagers that I know have dummy Instagram accounts like for their parents, and then ones with different names and different identities. But a lot of that, particularly for like queer kids, a lot of that is out of necessity. And I'm wondering what the broader like social implications are for those kids too.
Yeah, I think that's something that came up a lot. It's just the inescapability of changing your identity.
Yeah.
Given that Facebook just doesn't recognize the needs of certain populations.
Right.
And so in their mind, everybody is one identity, one person, has always been that identity, will always be that identity. And they want to be connected to everybody that they know, because Facebook wants its social network to be as large as possible.
Right.
And people who have more friends use the network more. So they just see it as friend them.
Yeah.
Get them on the site more. And that just doesn't work for everybody, unfortunately.
Right.
And when I asked Facebook about, can you opt out of this feature? They said, you don't need to opt out of it. Like, how can you, knowing that there are these possible effects, like, what can you do to protect your account from this? And originally they told me, oh, you can limit who can send you friend requests. And so you can limit it to friends of friends.
Yeah.
Or if you're a public figure, I discovered, you can limit it to no one.
Right.
So you can do this, and then you'll be limited in where you appear. But then they're like, oh, actually, we're wrong. Even if you say only friends of friends can friend you, you'll still appear in everybody's people you may know.
Yeah.
And I said, I think that's really odd. And they said, yeah, you're right. Like, we should change that. So they like obviously hadn't thought it through. And then they've since sent me other advice. They say, you know, you don't have to put your face in your profile photo. You don't have to make your posts public. You can make them private so people can't see them. But it was all things that you had to figure out.
Right.
There's not a setting where you can just say, I want to make my account more private. Like, I have privacy concerns. I want to limit this. So I just think that's unfortunate.
If you're using your real name, regardless of whether you do all those things, your account then would be visible. And that still can potentially create awkwardness, right? Like, if you're being recommended to your boss and your coworkers, even if they can't see your face, if you have a name like any of our names that are not particularly generic, they're going to know you have a Facebook account, and then your unwillingness to friend them might be taken as a slight.
Right.
It's still setting you up for social awkwardness or social problems, even if they can't access the full content of your posts or see what groups you're a part of or whatever. Right. It's still putting you in a difficult situation.
Yeah, like Jesse, I just think your example is such a good example. And what I just keep encountering is there's a reason that it should be a public Instagram account. I want to have that account.
Yeah. I
just don't want that account to be pushed, aggressively towards the rest of my neighborhood. Like, it's just a different audience for that.
It's a different audience, which is not at all to say that I don't want anybody to see it or it's a secret. Obviously, you want it to be public because it's not supposed to be a secret like that. You have it for a reason. But yeah, you don't need it broadcasted to people who you don't need it broadcasted to.
Particularly not the neighborhood kids.
Right.
I mean, the moms are one thing, but
But yeah, I mean, once kids get to middle school and high school, I also get in my Facebook feed a bunch of high schoolers, that are connected in some way. And there's no reason that I shouldn't be able to have a profile and counts that are more adult themed that I keep separate from people I want to keep it separate from. whoever I deem that to be.
And what I hate about all this is it seems like you have to be just like an expert in computer security if you do want to maintain separate identities. Like you need to have a separate computer, you need to be using Tor.
That's what he suggested. He's like, well, why don't you? We can just get like Tor and then you can use a separate IP address. And I was like, to post a picture on Instagram, like I can't manage this.
To be fair, I didn't suggest it. I simply said that was, at this point, what I thought was the only possibility.
Yeah.
I wasn't saying it was a good option. I was just saying it's the only thing I can think of.
Right.
Like it's horrible to feel that this platform that you use, it's like a social network, it's supposed to be fun, is kind of like weaponizing the information you've given it to harm you.
Right. I think that's a really important thing to think about.
Yeah. And again, I think we've made this point, but just to circle back to it, it's particularly acute for certain marginalized groups, whether it's women who are dealing with abusive relationships, whether it's queer youth, whether it's sex workers. It just strikes me that there are certain groups which happen to probably be underrepresented among computer programmers who are particularly acutely affected by this issue. And I don't want to get too much on a hobby horse, but the journalism that you're doing is important. And I think it's also important for companies to be hiring people who, whether they're journalists, whether they're sociologists, but have a background in social issues and not just computer science, because it just seems like there are gross oversights that happen in these design issues. And perhaps part of it is just that a company that's so massive as Facebook, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So you get enormous inconsistencies, as with between who can send you a friend request and who's recommended in the people you may know.
It just seems like a complete disconnect, though, for somebody to say something like, I don't know why anybody would want to opt out of the people you may know option.
Yeah.
What frustrates me is just how opaque it all is. Like I've never gotten to speak directly to the team that does people you may know. It's all filtered through the communications team. We don't get to know how these recommendations get made. So if you do see somebody disturbing that's getting recommended to you, you can't like click a button and have them say, oh, well, this was based on, this email address that you provided to us. So then you would know that you should delete that email address. So I just wish that there was more information provided and it didn't have to be so shadowy.
Right.
Because it just makes it so hard to protect yourself against this. Like you don't know where you cross the streams of your Instagram erotic photos account and then your real life vanilla account. And so you can't stop that from happening.
Yeah. I mean, I know this is completely unrealistic, but that would be a great thing if you could say like, why are you recommending this person to me? Oh, I'm recommending him because of this person. Oh, well, maybe this isn't like a safe way of having these sorts of communications then.
Though, to be fair, that would also come with privacy issues of its own,
That's
right?
True.
So it's complicated, but at least if you could get a sense of what you're feeding into the algorithm yourself, then you could make decisions to practice good data hygiene, as it were, and not feed it information that would be detrimental to you.
Right. Do you think, given that this is becoming more and more problematic for more people and the network is getting larger and larger and better at making these predictions of who you might know, do you think that there will be a shift in this? Is there any movement towards...
Like, will Facebook actually do something about it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I hope so. I mean, I was pleased that they are going to make that small change of not suggesting you as a friend to somebody who wouldn't be able to friend you.
Right.
Like that was a small victory for me as a tech reporter to get them to make that change.
I mean, that seems pretty significant.
Yeah, I would hope that they would have an opt-out. I just think there's some people who want to be on a network in a very targeted way. They know who they want their audience to be and who they want to connect with, and they just don't need to be randomly pushed out to everyone that they might know. And so I just keep trying to document stories about things that have happened and maybe can convince them or at least inform them that this is a harmful feature for some of their users.
Right.
And it's a minority of their users, but for those users, it can be quite harmful.
Well, yeah, it can be dangerous for a lot of those users. And I think that they need to take some sort of accountability for that.
Right. I think probably what they're missing is that a lot of people have opted out of those networks or those accounts altogether because they cannot opt out of the recommendation algorithms. They feel like it's too risky,
invasive and
too opaque, and they can't have the level of privacy they would like to have, and they feel like being on those platforms would put their families at risk.
Yeah.
And so they just simply don't use them.
Mm-hmm.
And one example of this that I love is that it's hard even for the director of the FBI to manage these systems. James Comey, former director of the FBI, said during some event that he had a secret Twitter account and a secret Instagram account and only had a few friends on them, but he did use them. And my colleague at the time, Ashley Feinberg, went to try to hunt them down. And she eventually figured out James Comey's son's Instagram account. And when she went to follow it, Instagram said, here's some other people that you might be interested in, and just offered up James Comey's Instagram account. And so
that's wild.
This is just a hard problem for many people beyond the ones you would immediately identify.
Well, it's so funny that you bring that up, because I was thinking, as you were telling me, well, the best way to do this would be to go through different servers to do all this. And I was thinking, I just want to share pictures. I'm not like in the FBI.
But even if you were, you'd still be screwed.
Yeah, that's amazing, actually. You would think that person would be able to figure out how to do it.
It's just hard. I mean, so many of the things that we do today, and this is what initially attracted me to privacy, is just like everything leaves a trace now, because so much of our lives are just mediated through technology or accompanied by technology. And I think it's hard not to send these signals to Facebook that they can use to figure out who we know. It's really challenging.
So since you've been investigating this, have you changed your behavior?
This isn't something I worry about necessarily for myself. One thing I did is we built a tool that I've been using to keep track of my own friend recommendations, just trying to figure out what the signals are that cause things to happen. And through the course of doing that, there was a person recommended to me whose last name was my kind of complicated, but my father's biological father's last name, a man that he didn't know about until he was an adult.
Wow.
And she was from the place where my extended family is from. And so I said, Dad, is this person related to us? And he's like, I don't think so. And I contacted her, and she's my great aunt. Whoa. And so somehow Facebook managed to connect me with my great aunt that I didn't know that I had. And I still don't know, again, how they connected us.
Wow.
I don't think they have an ancestry database. The way a lot of these creepy things happen is contact chaining, where enough people have uploaded their contacts to Facebook that Facebook just has this immense database of who knows who, where they can make this kind of spider web. And then you can like follow contacts from one contact to the next contact. And it's kind of like, what's that game? The 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Yeah.
The more than 1 billion people on Facebook.
The problem is, I think that there's something actually alluring about that too, because it's kind of exciting when it's not a negative thing, or when it doesn't negatively impact you. You could be like, wow, that's really neat. I haven't seen this person in 20 years. How neat that they just popped up. So
it can be serendipitous. And I think that's why Facebook promotes the feature. And a lot of people probably like the feature, but also there's also people get annoyed, when it's your ex or your landlord from 15 years ago, or an abusive partner or abusive family members that you've been trying to get away from, and then they keep popping up there.
Yeah. Do you have any final questions?
Well, I mean, I would ask what people can do to avoid unwanted contacts in the people you may know, but it sounds like it's not much at this point, apart from just dumping the platform altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're worried about it surfacing your identity, then having a photo that's not of your face or clearly identifying you. You can remove suggestions so that they're not made to you again, but it doesn't remove you from being suggested to them, which again, I think is a bad design decision by Facebook. Yeah,
definitely.
And something I hope I can convince them to change.
Yeah, you would think that they would take the signal that if you remove that person, it's because you don't want to be connected to them.
Right. You'd think so. That seems intuitive, doesn't it?
It does. It really does.
And then there is a part of Facebook where you can go to your settings page and see all the contact you've uploaded. So you could go and check there. And that may be part of the reason why you're seeing the suggestions that you're seeing, and you can delete it. And Facebook says that they fully delete that and don't use it anymore to make recommendations to you.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty concrete step that people can take if you have like a old existing Facebook account.
Yeah. I've never even looked at that.
To be honest.
Yeah, I'll send you guys the link to it, and you can see who's in there, if anybody.
Yeah. I don't even think it ever occurred to me to do that. And that's why I think a lot of this is so problematic, is that the everyday user doesn't even know how to navigate the site.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Different people have different levels of knowledge about Facebook. And so I think that's also challenging. Like some people send me, oh, this creepy thing happened to me. This person got recommended to me. I'll be like, oh, that person has your phone number and they probably uploaded their contacts to Facebook and that's why it's happening. And they're like, oh, I had no idea that's how it worked. And so some people realize that's how it works and other people don't. And and it's also other people safeguarding your privacy. So if all of your friends upload their contacts to Facebook, even if you don't, they're still going to be able to build a pretty 360-degree view of your social network.
Actually, that's a really good point too. Often when we talk about privacy, we talk about it as an individual problem or a personal problem. And we tend not to talk about privacy as being a social issue or a collective problem. But I do think, given the nature of these social media platforms, it probably is really important to start thinking of it more collectively and more politically, and what steps we can take together collectively to safeguard each other. And that's just not a language I hear very much right now.
I think that's true. Yeah. But with these kinds of network analysis tools, it is something you have to think about.
All right. Well, this was really great. We're super appreciative of you taking the time to come on and chat with us about these things. And I know a lot of people in the communities that we talk about and
live in
and interact with have a huge stake in these
issues.
In these issues. And thanks for all the great work you've been doing.
Oh, thank you. And I'll send you this link in case you want to provide it to listeners if they want to check and see
that would be
what
great.
Contacts they've given to Facebook.
And where can people find your writing?
They can find it on the Gizmodo media sites, Twitter links, Cash Hill on Twitter, and the only thing I use Facebook for anymore is basically posting my articles. So
okay. So on Facebook too. It's funny to talk about Facebook privacy and then end it with Facebook. Plugging Facebook.
I know, isn't that? It's definitely an issue for technology journalists and newspaper publishers in general that we rely so heavily on these tech companies that we're also supposed to be covering critically.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of impossible to do anything that's public-facing without them, though. All right, well, thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah, have a good night.
It was great talking to you.
Bye.
Bye, you guys. It was great.
Reese Piper is a journalist, stripper, and autistic woman. She reports on sex work challenges, migrant issues, and the secret lives of autistic women. She is one of the creators of the FckShameProject, which is an online platform for sex workers to voice trauma. She resides in Brooklyn, but travels often for work. You can follow her at The Nude Reporter. Welcome. How are you doing?
Good. How are you guys doing today?
Good.
Great. We're happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we invited you on mostly because I follow you on Twitter, and I really like what you're doing, both with your own personal account and then with the FckShameProject account. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your work. I noticed that you're a journalist and a stripper and that you're very open about your autism. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your history and how you got into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, great. So as you said, I'm a journalist and a storyteller, and I am an autistic woman and a stripper. And I started stripping 2 years ago when I was 24. I was living in Melbourne, Australia on a work and holiday visa, that allows you to work and live there.
Yeah, I did that in New Zealand, actually.
Did you? Same thing, definitely. Yeah. I did a year there.
Wow.
So yeah, I was 24 and, like many Americans my age, I have a huge student loan. My payments are a little over $600 a month, which
wow,
that is massive, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And out of college, that limited a lot of options for me. But, after about a year out of school, I was working an office job that I wasn't happy at. And what I really wanted, I just wanted to travel freely without a lot of worries.
Yeah.
So what I did was I saved up 9 months of payments and I put it in this separate American bank account that I didn't think about it, and I just put it away. And so when I got to Australia, I got a job. I just really didn't think about my loan. But of course, after 9 months, it ran out. So I really sort of tossed and turned over what to do. I tried out at a bar one night, but I found it really difficult for not a lot of pay because there isn't the tipping system there.
Oh, yeah, that's
true.
true.
And I just wasn't really ready to go home. I loved Australia and I wanted to travel to India and Europe. But with the exchange rate at that time, it was going to be around 900 Australian dollars a month.
To pay your student loans.
Pay my student loan.
Yeah.
So I had like a pros and cons list about what to do, like a bit of a nerd. But I decided, stripping was the best decision for me. I was living in hostels at the time, and I met a bunch of strippers during my travels, and one who's still a very good friend today.
Uh-huh.
To me, like, their lives were very intriguing. They traveled to Bali on a whim. They laid out on the beach during the day, and they had all these wild stories and this like seemingly endless flow of cash.
Yeah.
But I did feel like they were surrounded by these toxic customers. And at the same time, the idea of working nights, like for a morning person, is really daunting. I wasn't really ready to take that.
I hear that.
Yeah. It just felt really overwhelming. But,
like for somebody who wants to fall asleep at like 10:30, it would be hard.
You're just getting starting at a strip club.
Yeah, I really had to change my clock around, and it took some time, a lot of coffee and stuff. So yeah, in the face of taking a bar job and not having any free time, or working 2 nights in the week on top of my office job, so I chose to strip.
Yeah. Were you like a dancer before that?
No, I'd never danced before in my life. I was not the best.
See,
it was like pity.
That might seem like a stupid question, but every once in a while, like, I think, stripping would be great, except then I'm like, but I can't dance. So no. I think this opportunity is foreclosed. I can't do it.
I mean, luckily, like, stage work isn't as big of a thing in Australia and in like New Zealand and England because there isn't the tipping system like we have here.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting.
But still, I would get up there and it would just be like, I just would smile, or I would just talk to people because dancing was not exactly my thing.
So what was the main, how did strippers make money in those countries?
You make money either talking or through private rooms. Now, in each club is different, but the club that I worked at was a communal private room setup. So it's not like in America where you can do a dance on the floor.
Yeah.
There's like one big lounge and couches are separated by fringe curtains.
Oh, okay.
So everyone doing dances like in a separate area from the floor, but sort of in front of each other.
Yeah.
And in some clubs in Australia, there are even more private rooms like they have here. Mm-hmm. But that's how I started out. And I started out in a club that was a communal private room.
Okay. And what has your experience been like as a stripper?
I mean, originally, when I first started dancing in Australia, my experiences were really positive. I met all these great women and I was having a really great time doing it. And the effects of it were very empowering at first. But I danced in Australia for about 3 months. And then after that, my visa ran out and I came home to New York, where I started dancing in Manhattan. A lot of my experiences in Australia were positive. A lot of mine in New York were not.
Okay. What were the differences?
It's a combined factor of other things that were going on in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I was living in an apartment I didn't want to be in. I was working an unpaid internship, so I was more stressed.
Yeah.
But the number one thing was just not knowing what was going on and what was expected of me.
Yeah.
My first night working in Manhattan, the manager comes and he gives you this whole speech about how there's no contact between you and the customer. And then I stepped out onto the floor 5 minutes later and I saw this girl getting her boobs grabbed and her butt cheeks spread apart. And it just sort of shocked me because it was just such a lie.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering there and then, like, what other rules are a lie? Are people having sex in the back room? Are people giving hand jobs? Are there blowjobs going on? And just not knowing put me in a very vulnerable situation. And it was really scary.
Yeah.
I didn't feel scared to dance in Australia, whereas I felt scared when I came home.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. And part of that fear probably was like not understanding what the disconnect was between what they were saying your job was and what it looked like your job actually was.
Yeah, 100%. And in being like autistic, it's really hard for me to comprehend nonverbal rules.
Sure.
It's like I can do really well in any situation. I just need to know what's happening. I need to be spoken. I need to be told.
Yeah.
And obviously, I learned that there is sex going on in Manhattan, but it's happening at a really high price.
Okay.
And I could have navigated that if I had known that. You can tell customers like, hey, it's not going to happen unless you pay me. You throw out this really intense number.
Right.
But if you don't know that, it's really difficult to navigate that space.
Yeah, you bring up actually a really important point about the fact that for strippers and sex workers who are autistic, those sorts of unspoken rules and those sort of unspoken norms make the whole experience a lot more difficult to navigate.
Yeah, I definitely think. And I think it's difficult for all people. Like, it's unless you're really good on picking up nonverbal cues. And I mean, as a dancer, I have learned to, but I do think autistic women are particularly vulnerable. But if you're just someone who has never worked in Manhattan or never worked without cameras in the private rooms, it can be a really daunting experience and you don't know what's happening. People need to know when you enter a job, what are the rules, like what's going on, so they can do that safely.
Do you think because Australia has less restrictive sex work laws that in Australia the rules are clearer, or maybe things are a little more above board and the rules are a little more straightforward?
Yeah, I did think that when I was in Australia, because if you wanted to hire someone for sex, you would go to a brothel, and there are legal brothels in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And so it makes the boundary is very clear. Like, you're going to a strip club to be entertained.
Sure. Yeah.
And that boundary is different. Versus here, a lot of times strip clubs are operating as brothels, which is kind of like Providence, which up until recently, up until like 2009, sex work was decriminalized. And when that became criminal, they just moved the brothels to the strip clubs.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I know a lot of dancers can become really bitter about that. I try to be really careful of my language because I don't want to be horphobic and just saying that it's not fair that happens. But I think just the issue of people not knowing when they're entering that space, a dancer that's on the spectrum, or if it's just like a new job, or if you're a new city or a new country.
Sure.
And you don't know what's going on. No one tells you. None of the dancers tell you that there's sex going on in the back. So I think that's where some of my negative experiences have come in, because I just wasn't aware of what was going on.
I hear what you're saying, because I don't think that it's necessarily horphobic to say there's a particular job that I wanted to do or that I signed up to do, and I didn't realize that these other things were happening. And had I known that, would have either made a choice to participate in that or not. But if you don't even know that that's part of the job, then it's really much more difficult to negotiate that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just difficult to negotiate when you're just unaware of.
Yeah, because I don't hear you saying anything negative about sexual transactions by themselves.
Right, or people who do escorting, or even strippers who offer
full services.
Full services. It's more just the expectations aren't clear, or you have managers saying one thing when actually the norm is something completely different.
Yeah, and I think that's actually where it becomes dangerous.
Yeah.
We have this concept that stripping is sort of the safer sex work because it's legal. And while I don't feel like it's fair to say any sex work is safer than the other, I do really sort of resent when people say that, because sometimes clubs are really dangerous. I have been sexually assaulted in the champagne rooms, and that's happened because I wasn't aware of what was going on. Now I know how to navigate these spaces a lot safer. Like, I can understand certain cues. I get what's happening.
Right.
But if no one's helping you, if you're alone, if you're not with a friend, it's your first time working in this club and you drink, and if your customer, someone buys you a lot of drinks and you've had too much to drink, it can become a very dangerous environment. And I think that, to me, is why I started to really sort of speak out, because I feel like the world is warming up to the idea that stripping is a profession. We have strippers out in the media. We have Cardi B, we have Black China, and we have all these other amazing strippers that are out.
Yeah.
And while they do talk about the conditions, I still don't feel like the world understands the conditions that we work under. Like, even the simple fact that dancers are the ones that approach and sell dances to customers, not the other way around. Like most people don't know that, or that there are private rooms without cameras or management that are not protecting us in private rooms, or even that we work sometimes 10 to 12-hour shifts. And so that's kind of why I really wanted to start speaking out and speaking candidly about the realities of the profession. Because I do think when you're starting out in a new club, or when you're a new stripper, or even if you've done full service and you want to start becoming a stripper,
right,
it's important that you understand some of the dangers that come along with the profession so that you can operate safely.
Yeah, is it that same feeling and impulse that was behind starting the FckShameProject?
Yeah, definitely. That was sort of what started the movement.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the FckShameProject started back in July when the Bachanella group, which are two sex workers, Countless Hannibal and Elliot Salome, tweeted, "We need to hold a healing space for trauma, particularly from sex work, without condemning sex work," which maybe to the outside seems like a really simple tweet, yet the complexity of it really sort of struck me.
Mm-hmm.
And before I really even had like a second to filter my thoughts, my experiences of being sexually assaulted in the champagne room in Manhattan, like they spilled out of me.
Yeah.
And more importantly, like how the inability to speak out about what happened, stopped me from labeling it as sexual assault.
Yeah.
And the responses from there flooded in, and two other workers, Kate Kinsley and then Gia Piccato, came forward about their negative experiences as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the five of us decided to get together and build a platform designed with the sole purpose of providing like a space for sex workers to voice trauma or just bad days on the job.
Yeah, it seems to me like that's so important because there's such a reticence to do that because sex workers work so hard to talk about the legitimacy of their choices of being in the type of work that they're in.
Yeah, and it seems like there are a lot of critics of sex work or people who assume sex work's inherently bad that will use any story or any time a sex worker talks about a bad day on the job or something they're struggling with to try to prove that sex work is inherently exploitative, and sex workers' own words are turned against them anytime they speak out to talk about difficulties they're facing.
Yeah, and it's risky to come forward, like what you're saying. Our trauma can be used to promote this like anti-sex work agenda, and can be co-opted. And there are really large implications to speaking out. And I'm fully aware of how radical it is because there are plenty of people who are like covertly promoting this anti-sex work agenda under like banner feminism. And not only that, they use our trauma to make these sweeping statements about our job.
Right.
And when I see this, it's really conflicting for me because when I see like Caitlin Roper, who is a huge anti-sex work promoter, who was platformed quite a lot, and when I wake up and I see that she's been platformed again about the evils of prostitution, like I'm thinking to myself, am I doing the right thing?
Yeah.
Like, should I only be talking about the amazing parts of my job?
Yeah.
Because sex workers, we are like at war with anti-sex advocates who are out there trying to take away our livelihoods, who are trying to throw us or our clients in jail or push all these unnecessary and misguided regulations on our bodies.
Or who silence us in a way and saying like, you can't possibly understand your own motivations for doing something and you must be wrong about what you say about yourself and your own experience.
Yeah, it's very patronizing. It's very gaslighting in that way, almost in a way.
Right. It is gaslighting. I hadn't actually thought about that word in relationship to this issue, but I think that's exactly right. You know, you must be crazy, or you must be so brainwashed by the patriarchy, or you must be coerced into doing something. That's what kind of struck me about the power of your project, I think, or of the project that you're a part of. I think you're right. It is radical, creating a space to say, as in every profession, there are things about this that I don't like, or things that need to be spoken about, or
things that could be better.
Things that could be better, or things that are problematic, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel justified in this
that
as
you're
a job.
not. It doesn't mean that you're not choosing this, or that you haven't, you said earlier, made a pro and con list and decided that for your situation right now, this choice is the best choice for you.
Yeah, it is still the best choice for me, even though there are risks. And when we make these sweeping statements, then we're just saying all of it's bad.
Right.
All of it is not bad. And you're missing this really amazing opportunity to promote labor rights and labor conditions. And so when we just make these really sweeping statements, we're blinding like the world to the conditions that we work in.
Yeah.
We could be working towards making sure the clubs that are operating under these really terrible conditions, like improving those.
Right.
And, sort of using the ones that are helping strippers thrive and using those as an example.
Yeah.
But if we just sit there and offer blank statements, like all of that conversation is lost.
Right. Yeah. It completely shuts that conversation down. If we're going to just say none of this should be happening, it forecloses the possibility of there being any sort of productive movement for change.
Yeah, it's definitely. And I think part of the goal that I had for the project and in my own work as like a journalist is that I want to breathe ambiguity into sex work that other jobs like are allowed to have,
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That there's something so black and white about the rhetoric that surrounds sex work.
Yeah, it is. It's true. It's so black and white. And that black and white, I think, is also really dangerous for us because journalists, they love to peddle this concept that is sex work empowering or is it slave labor?
Yeah.
And
those are like the only two options.
Yeah, it is. And if you put that on another profession, it sounds really ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's like, is working on Wall Street empowering or are they just slaving away for the man? Or like... Or just like another actress comes out against Harvey Weinstein. Will actresses finally admit how damaging the industry is for women? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, right. To just throw out an entire endeavor. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I think more than that, like sort of what I've been like exploring with this project and in my own work lately is that what happens to us as sex workers when the only narratives that we have available are these empowering and victimizing? Like how then do we process our middle range experiences?
Yeah.
And for me, when I was sexually assaulted in Manhattan, it completely like went away in my head. I tucked it away and I didn't think about it.
Right. Because it didn't fit into one of those two.
Exactly.
Right.
Because I feel empowered by my work sometimes. And so it didn't fit within that narrative. So I just shut it off.
Right.
Because...
Or that if you were to talk about it in the way that you actually experienced it, it might threaten the narrative that you've come to identify with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I remember I opened this article, I think it was by The Establishment, and it was like, I was sexually assaulted. Why didn't I fight back? And I remember I just opened it and I closed it right away. And I was like, I couldn't even look at it because to me, I was working this unpaid internship with all these non-sex workers who didn't have the best views on sex work. So I had to like really sort of be fighting every day to promote myself as this like woman of agency, as this person who loves her job.
Yeah.
And yet like on the weekends, I was like sexually assaulted at my job. And yet it was this very sort of conflicting feelings that I was having. And so, yeah, that's when I decided that it was time to sort of voice what was going on, I think.
Yeah, I think that that's really important. I think your voice is really important, and I think your project is really important. And I really appreciate this idea of breathing ambiguity into these very like polarizing narratives. Is there anything you want to plug while you're on?
Yeah, I guess if you are a sex worker that wants to submit a story to the FckShameProject, just contact us, DM me at The Nude Reporter or at the FckShameProject, spelled FCK. And yeah, we're accepting art submissions or stories or any other way that you want to express like your bad days, your distressing experiences, or trauma. And so we're starting this, and this should be up about next week.
Nice.
Or just follow me on Twitter and hear my stories.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for joining us today. We really enjoyed putting this episode together for you all. We appreciate the time and energy of our two very insightful guests, Kashmir Hill and Reese Piper. You can find Kashmir on Twitter at KashHill and Reese on Twitter at The Nude Reporter. I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at Sapiotextual.
I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me at Pej Sage.
And speaking of Patreon, we still have one and will continue to be a part of the collective effort to make the content guidelines more inclusive. We need your support to keep the podcast running, to pay for our website and the services that host and distribute the podcast. Please consider visiting our Patreon at patreon.com/peepshowpodcast and contributing. If only $1 a month, every little bit helps. Thanks to Joe Kennedy for the music. The show was produced by PJ Sage. Signing off. Have a great week.